Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. I'm so excited about tonight's program. We're celebrating the publication of a new book, Living Design, The Writings of Clara Porset, and we're also celebrating the debut Hammer Public Program with our wonderful new director, Zoë Ryan, who took the helm of the Hammer just 5 months ago, and we're thrilled to have her. Zoe will be joined by her co-editor, Valentina Cruz, and Brenda Danilowitz and Jane Hall to explore Clara Porset's groundbreaking contributions to mid-century modernism. Tonight's discussion will describe how Porset, a Cuban-born designer who made Mexico her home, challenged prevailing design orthodoxies by championing both handcraft and industrial production. The new book highlights her extensive writing practice, which was previously untranslated, and seeks to contextualize her place in global modernism while also addressing the broader theme of women's design writing as a form of intellectual resistance and self-positioning in traditionally male-dominated fields. So now I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guests for today's program. Brenda Danilowitz is an art historian and chief curator at the Joseph and Anni Albers Foundation. Her current research is centered on Anni Albers' intermediate processes between weaving and printmaking and their relation to algebraic and binary systems. She's co-curator of the upcoming exhibition Anni Albers Constructing Textiles that will open later this year at the Centrum Paul Klee in Bern, Switzerland. Dr. Jane Hall is the inaugural recipient of the British Council's Lena Bobardi Fellowship and a founding member of the Turner Prize-winning architecture collective Assemble. She specializes in the intersections of gender and architecture and is the author of 2 books, Breaking Ground, Architecture by Women, and Woman Made, Great Women Designers. Valentina Cruz is the co-editor of Living Design, The Writings of Clara Porset. She's an independent writer and researcher interested in the socio-political dimensions of space and sociolinguistics. She has a predilection for interdisciplinary approaches and experimental methodologies. Currently, she's collaborating on a research project on the crisis of missing people in Mexico at the Free University of Berlin. Previously, she worked at the Art Institute of Chicago, the University of Chicago, Art Forum, and Creative Time. And finally, Zoë Ryan is the new director of the Hammer Museum. Previously, she was director of the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania. From 2006 to 2020, Ryan was the chair and curator of architecture and design at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she set the vision for collecting and exhibiting modern and contemporary architecture and design, overseeing a collection of more than 2,500 objects, 2,500 objects, including works on paper, textiles, architectural models, furniture, and photography. In 2014, she was the curator of the second Istanbul Design Biennial, The Future is Not What It Used to Be. She's also taught graduate courses in design history and theory at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the University of Illinois at Chicago. Additional projects have included the exhibition and catalog In a Cloud, In a Wall, In a Chair, 6 Modernists in Mexico at Mid-Century. The edited volume, As Seen, Exhibitions That Made Architecture and Design History, and major survey exhibitions of the works of several architects and designers. After tonight's discussion, we will have a chance to continue the conversation over some light refreshments in the Hammer Courtyard, and we'll have some books available for sale and a little book signing. And now, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Brenda Danilowitz, Jane Hall, Valentina Cruz, and Zoë Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for being with us. Firstly, I'd just like to thank Claudia for that lovely introduction and welcome you all again, and thank you for joining us. I am absolutely delighted to be here with my brilliant panelists today to celebrate this new book, which I have in my hands, Living Design, The Writings of Clara Porset, which Vali and I co-edited. Firstly, I want to thank the Hammer staff, obviously Claudia and Shannon, for doing such a fabulous job organising this programme. And I'd also like to thank Meredith Carruthers and Ryan Van Weesty, who are at the Concordia University Press, who believed in this project, supported it from the get-go, and we can't thank them enough. And then heartfelt thanks to my co-panelists for joining us today. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Vali and I always were really interested in a book on Clara Porset that would just be a jumping off point for either people learning more about Clara or also learning more about art and design at mid-century. So we thought it would be good, though, at the beginning if we set the stage a bit. I know some of you know who Clara Porset is and others might not do. So Vali and I are going to do a brief introduction. We're going to tag team on Porset and the book, and then we will have a conversation between the four of us, and then we will open the floor for your questions. So please have them at the ready. So this book took 5 years to complete. There was many things going on in those 5 years, but one of the hardest things was actually just developing the bibliography and really tracking down Clara Porset's writings. And we would like to thank curator Anna Elena Millay and Professor Randall Shepherd for their integral work helping us with that. The book actually builds off research that Valentina and I started when we were both at the Art Institute of Chicago, looking at Clara Porset, understanding her to be born in Cuba in 1895 and then died in Mexico City in 1981. And through our research, we just uncovered how important her design, her teachings, her writings were, and how much they transformed Mexico's industrial design landscape at that time, but also how little was actually known about Clara Porset. So this type of work, uncovering under-recognized voices and ideas, is very much at the core of the work we do here at the Hammer. So it's fantastic to be here to launch the book. So I'm just going to show a few slides. The first one is it's an interesting one for us because it shows Clara Porset here with one of her craftspeople. And very much speaks to Clara Porset's approach to working. She always worked very hand in hand, collaborating with skilled craftspeople to design furniture and interiors. Here I am in 2018, I believe, with a group from the Art Institute, or 2019 it says on the slide, with a group from the Art Institute where we were looking at Clara Porset's archive. It's at UNAM. In Mexico City, and this is where all her drawings, her papers, a number of unpublished lectures and manuscripts are. And it was really visiting this archive, which I found out about by curator Anna Elena Millay, and just the breadth of the work that we saw there, and then going to visit and seeing Clara Porset's work in situ. So if you've ever had the fortune of going to a Luis Barragan home, you will probably have seen some of Clara Porset's work. And it's kind of amazing that so much that was commissioned, 50 years or more ago, is still in people's homes being used today. So Clara Porset was born in Cuba. She left Havana as a political emigre around 1934 and then spent the rest of her life in Mexico. And in 2019, Vali and I organised the exhibition, which Claudia mentioned, In a Cloud, in a Wall, in a Chair, 6 Modernists in Mexico at Mid-Century. And the idea with this exhibition, and you're seeing the slides up right now of that show, was really to position Clara Porset amongst a really transnational group of artists and designers, people that she was very close with and connected to in some way. And the title of the show comes from a quote from Clara Porset, where she says, "There is design in everything, in a cloud, in a wall, in the sea, in the sand, in a chair, in a pot." And this idea of design being everything fostered our thesis, which was to position Porset again amongst this group of incredible practitioners. And this included Anni Albers, who Brenda is going to speak about today, who was very close with Clara Porset. Clara Porset was the one that encouraged the Albers to go to Mexico. They then went 17 more times and really did a lot of traveling around the country with Clara Porset and with Clara Porset's husband, Javier Guerrero, who was a Mexican painter. Also in the show were Porset's friend, the photographer, Lola Alvarez Bravo, the textile designer, Cynthia Sargent, who Porset worked with, and artist Ruth Asawa, whose work you see here. Ruth Asawa, in her oral history, remembers going to a lecture by Clara Porset in Mexico, and at the end she went up with a sample of the basket weaving technique that she'd found in Mexico City, and she recalls going up and asking Clara Porset what she thought about this, and if this would be kind of a good starting point, because in the States then, she said, craft wasn't seen as a high art form. And apparently Clara Porset obviously said, just go for it, and the rest is history. And then the last artist that was in this exhibition was Sheila Hicks, who remembers meeting Clara on one of her trips to visit with Luis Barragan, who she was close to. So it was while we were doing the research for this exhibition that we came across Clara Porset's writings, and both published and unpublished articles and lectures on design. And between 1930 and 1936, Clara Porset published at least 58 articles in magazines and journals in Cuba, in Mexico, and in the United States. And in our book, we selected 39 of these, some never before published texts, and the majority translated to English for the first time. So for us, the breadth of Porset's writing underscores just how essential this part of her practice was. For Clara, writing was a tool, a way to develop her ideas and advocate for the critical role that she felt design held within everyday life as a really catalytic force. She really believed, as many modernists did at that time, and many of us still do, that design could improve people's lives. And then finally, her writings are also a really important resource for understanding the history of design in Latin America at this moment. We know of so few women who wrote and who were published at this time, writing about design. So I look forward to delving in with our panelists today, and I'm going to pass the floor to Valerie so she can tell you more about the writing.
Thank you, Zoe, and yes, thank you to everyone at the Hammer for making this possible. It's really exciting, and I'm really happy to be here. So yes, Clara Porset, designer, curator, teacher, but also writer, and there you go. So she did use writing. We came to understand she used writing as a platform to continue to expand the reach of her ideas and her design principles. And she first started publishing regularly on a monthly basis in this magazine, Social, which was produced and printed in Havana. And it was a sort of lifestyle magazine that also featured contributors, artists, philosophers, nationally, internationally, artists, philosophers, a few politicians, poets, and always with a progressive political tendency. And so it was interesting to see her work and design starting to become a field in these types of outlets. And she usually, at this point, used these very short pieces, 2-3 pages long, to continue sort of her investigations and pursue what she had already started to study elsewhere and cover either practitioners such as architects or designers or artists that she believed were using modernist or creating modernist work. A couple of examples are the ones that we can see on the slide here, like Mallory Stevens and Walter Gropius, but also Adolf Loos. She also wrote about industrial art, which included ceramics or glassware, rugs even, and textiles. She also wrote about specific buildings, such as the New School for Social Research in New York, and specific spaces of daily use. So she would write about theaters, about shops, and she even has a piece that we enjoy because it's funny that she wrote about bathrooms and how to make a bathroom a modernist bathroom. And so she was very much interested in just daily activities and how we could, or how design could make those spaces work to fulfill a particular function, and how to get rid of what she named superfluous ornamentation. Mm-hmm. So when she looked at the building for the New School, for instance, she was very interested in how a classroom could be conducive to to interdisciplinary education, which was interesting to be thinking about already at that time. And so we see how her alignment to ideas and how the influence from the Bauhaus was already becoming sort of apparent through her writing. But she specifically wrote about Gropius in 1932 in a monographic piece. And a couple of years later, she corresponded with him because she was interested in coming to the Bauhaus, to attend the Bauhaus. However, that was already 1934, and the times were not the most welcoming. And so he suggested instead that she wrote to Joseph Albers, and which she did, and ended up going to Black Mountain College in North Carolina. That's where they met Joseph, Anni, and Clara Porset, and then became good friends, as Zoe was just mentioning. And then, yes, between 1934 and 1935, Porset arrived in Mexico, and as a political exilee, and there was a number of years where she didn't publish anything, and we can only speculate why. We're not quite sure of whether she was just adapting. Her political activity was also strong during those years, so maybe she was focusing on that for a little bit. But once she started publishing again, sort of as to make up for the years lost, quote unquote, she didn't stop. So she kept publishing, and she published in a few of the most influential outlets in Mexico at that time, specialized magazines in architecture and in the arts. A couple of these that I want to briefly touch on are Arquitectura México, which we can see right here in the slide, and Espacios. They each had a very different approach. Espacios was a beautiful object. It was a long format, horizontal, with lots of different papers and drawings and colors. And it precisely sought that. One of the pillars that they wanted to sort of push for was plastic integration, which meant that every practitioner should consider all of the arts to make architecture a successful, architecturally a successful space. And this was highly promoted at the time. David Alfaro Siqueiros, one of the three big main male muralists, lots of M's there, was Mexican, I could add another one, but was a big promoter, and that was sort of what they were looking for in the Espacios magazine, which was convenient for Porset as she was trying to place design as an important discipline, because at that point it wasn't considered so. And this one, Arquitectura México, was founded by Mario Pani, a very influential architect that had all the necessary connections to get a lot of commissions from the government that was trying to develop Mexico City in the 1940s and 50s. And so he, influenced by Le Corbusier, he built a lot of very important and to this day very significant housing units. And so Porset not only published in Arquitectura México, but she also collaborated with Mario Pani with her designs for the units that he created, that he constructed. And what one would have hoped, or I guess nowadays I would have hoped, that considering the influence and the power that Mario Pani had in sort of this external built environment, that maybe Porset as a close collaborator would have had a similar influence in the interior of these apartment buildings. However, and as we learned through her writing, that wasn't so much the case. So she was very well connected to all of these male architects. However, she was pushing the limits, and that was not often, it was hard. It was a hard task to do. So that was really interesting because half of what she published in Arquitectura México was actually reflections and descriptions of her own projects. And through that, we get to see the things that she thought were successful, but as we also see things that she didn't consider or deemed as she would have hoped. And so there were some pieces that where she observes things that failed, or in her perspective failed. And yeah, so that's only interesting insofar, or that's really interesting insofar as there being a space of how to align her design principles to her actual practice. Some of the things that she was really interested in was not just after traveling so much and so extensively, she came to really appreciate Mexican manual tradition for making things, and as is a focus of the modernist and the function that these things fulfilled on a daily basis. And so she was a big advocate for the man-made, but also she recognized the industrial development and wanted to also employ the machine. So this idea of both the handmade and the machine-made as a way to make things affordable as well. Because as Zoë was mentioning, she wanted design to be accessible and affordable to all, not just as a luxury that a few could afford. One of the other things that she found to be important for her design was to consider the climate, to consider the end user, to consider the environment, to use those locally sourced materials, as opposed to simply importing or copying styles or schools of thought from elsewhere, was just important. And she eventually, with all of this, she tried to improve the life quality of users, and eventually she was hoping that there would be some social change of a larger scale. Yeah.
Thanks. It is very funny to read her writings where she's both chastising other people and herself for things that haven't gone well or failures that you see, which is just so unusual. And she was quite daring even in this exhibition catalogue that you see here, The Art of Daily Life, which was a really important exhibition in Mexico, where in that catalogue she even takes the donors and the funders of the project to task that they haven't done enough, which, yeah, we had a good chuckle about. But as curators, Vali and I absolutely geeked out when we found out about this exhibition that Clara Porset curated in 1952 called The Art of Daily Life. Well-designed objects made in Mexico, which was held in Mexico City. And this really sort of represents some of what Veli talked about in terms of a very important turning point in Mexico's design and cultural history. So Clara Porset had traveled widely. She'd come down through New York. We know that she saw things like the Useful Objects show at MoMA or the Good Design shows in the 1930s and 40s. However, when she came to curate Art in Daily Life, this was the first exhibition of its kind in Mexico and arguably in the world to really showcase design in all its diversity. So what do we mean by that? Unlike at the time earlier exhibitions like those at MoMA, which were very much about industrial production, or exhibitions, some of which were at the Met at the same time and then in other parts of the world that really just focused on craft practices, as Vali said, Clara Porset knew that by bringing together the industrial and the handmade, this would feel more akin to the way that she could use all the kind of industries and resources of Mexico. So you see in this exhibition, textiles and there's over 100 objects. You see like these wooden chocolate pots made by artisans from the Yucatan, or copper pots and jugs from artisans from Michoacan, right next to industrial products like the industrial kitchen there, or the made out of sheet metal, or furniture, early chairs made by plastic by the Domus Company in Mexico. So this exhibition for us provides a real critical lens through which to understand, this artistic culture in the post-revolutionary period in Mexico, which is roughly the 1920s on, when the country was undergoing, rapid and enormous growth, industrialization, and change. And the other thing that I think is interesting about what Vali was talking about is the exhibition was also a visual thesis. So Clara Porset was using writing, she was using her teaching, she was using exhibitions to put forward what she referred to as and task designers with making our own kind of furniture. And that is work that reflected the histories, the cultures, the climate, the customs of Mexico, which she illustrated in this exhibition and also in other magazines. And I think Vale's going to talk more about that.
Yeah, so this is the other magazine, the one that I mentioned before, Espacios, the long format one, horizontal one. And as you can see, it's quite playful in its display. And this is an essay on the boutique, so one of the sort of signature pieces that Porset designed. And it's actually also in this piece that she covers other chairs in Mexican design and the production, like the way of producing. We can see a hammock that's handmade, and then right below a metallic chair that was used at UNAM as, or that had won rather a prize for students at UNAM. And this was part of her idea of living design and what living design meant as something that you should adapt to, and something that you have to keep the end user in mind. And this is just a, well, as I was saying earlier, Porset was very reflective on her work and on her practice, and she didn't only, her writing was not just about design, it was also about her political and ethical convictions. And so expanding the market was not necessarily an easy thing to do. It wasn't then and it isn't now. So she also wrote about that for, not just for Mexico, but also internationally. And she shared these difficulties with her friend Esther McCoy, architectural historian and critic Esther McCoy, here in California. And Esther McCoy, in turn, tried to build bridges for Porset in the US. She wrote about her work with and without Porset. She also tried to get this exhibition, Art in Daily Life, to travel to the US. And she tried to get Porset a commission for furniture at the UN. She tried a lot of things. Not a lot of them worked out. From the chairs that we were just looking at in the previous slide, Porset made an upholstered version for the US audience, but that didn't quite pick up either. So in spite of all these efforts, this was yet another thing that she cited in her correspondence with McCoy, that at some point she had some incentives and funds from the government, but making affordable, good design for everyday use was not something that was easily achievable. And yeah, these images here are just to show how she didn't sort of just give up, and her presence didn't go unnoticed. She published again in English, and here we show a piece that she published in Los Angeles Times. And I don't know, it's sort of great. As Zoe was saying at the beginning of the talk, we started this project 5 years ago, and it's sort of great to now be launching it in LA and trying to make up for what both Porset and McCoy were trying to do at the time. We didn't think that would happen, but it's a happy coincidence. Yeah, and back to you, Zoe, for wrapping up.
I just want to mention that image in the middle. So Esther McCoy, I guess, organised for a whole bunch of furniture to be sent to Julius Schulman, who then would stage it up in his photos in this sort of effort to get Clara Porset's work out. But it's lovely to come full circle and see Los Angeles back. Just to conclude this, I think what we take away from studying Porset's writing is that they are a real rich and singular resource for understanding the field of design in Cuba, in Mexico, and in other parts of the world, to be honest. Porset very much wanted to position Mexico as an international place, and at that time, and still today, you know, especially when we started this exhibition, we also wanted to debunk some myths about Mexico and the fact that there was this incredible open immigration policy at this point. So you see a lot of people going down to Mexico. You see a lot of the sharing that we're going to talk about in the panel. And I think that was also fascinating for us, especially at times when that narrative was not, it's not part of of the contemporary narrative around Mexico, particularly not with the relationship with our country. So for Porset, though, she was very keen to position Mexico as part of international conversations, while she advocated and attempted to clarify time and time again that which is design, as she writes, making the case for design as part, very essential to an evolving society. And well into the 1960s, she continued this thread of questioning whether an industrial design is, and I quote, an art, a science, or a new phenomenon particular to our era. So you can see that she's sort of grappling with what is this that I've launched myself into, even 35, 40 years later when she had been very successful. What was clear, though, that she was really committed to design as what she called a life force. And I love this concept. She really believed that design could improve lives. And you see this in her work. She did a lot of work for private residences, but she also worked on hospitals, housing, cinemas, schools. So she did a lot of work. And I think for us, these ideas resonate with many other practitioners at the time, but particularly with Anni Albers and with Lina Babardi, that Jane and Brenda are going to talk about today. So we loved when we worked on the exhibition, we loved the friendships that Clara Porset had, and one of them was obviously with Anni Albers. And I get a chance on stage now publicly to thank Brenda, because we had many, many conversations during the show, and Brenda dug up enormous amounts of research and continues to send us her research. If she finds anything on Clarita, she sends it to us so that Valerie and I can keep up to date. But thank you for all your efforts with that. We were on, but before we started thinking about this talk, or when we were on the telephone, working through it, you mentioned how Annie also proselytized on design through her writings, and like Clara was really intent to make the case in her writings about weaving, for example, as an art or a design. And Brenda, I think it'd be really lovely to hear from your perspective how Annie used writing as a tool herself, just like Clara did.
Thank you. Thank you, Zoe. Good evening. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this really important discussion about women, design, and writing. I think it's just wonderful. And thank you to all of the staff here at the Hammer who've been so friendly and helpful and kind in this very unfortunately short stay that I have in LA this time, but I'll be back. So I have to do this. Okay, so Annie and writing. Well, I just wanted to say before I kind of launch into the Annie and writing thing, is that when Zoe, you mentioned, in a cloud, in a
wall,
well, of course, Anni Albers extolled the form. She talked about what a complete form was, and to her, the form of, and she writes about this, of a milk bottle and a light bulb were far more important, far more complete as forms, because they were such a combination of the form and the function, whereas she really kind of railed against, in her quiet way, and especially after the war in the 40s, about consumerism and how there was this kind of need for possession of objects without any, and a proliferation of industrialized, cheaply made objects that really their forms were completely meaningless. So for her, she would much rather have had a good milk bottle and a good light bulb than anything else in her house. And I think that that's sort of really, she really got down to the nitty-gritty of it. Just briefly to talk about her writings, these are some of these are her publications. She wrote a lot of her works and her ideas were published in magazines and then collected into the books that you see here. The book Anni Albers on Designing, which is now out of print, but I have a copy of it. You can't buy one, but I have one. But those writings were collected. I edited another collection of the writings in the book in the lower right here, Anni Albers on Selected Writings on Design, which you can buy outside after the talk. Many of these articles she published in magazines at the time. One that comes to mind is a magazine called Craft Horizons, which was a craft book, not an architecture book, not a book about art or painting, but a book about design, which was very important, a magazine about design, a monthly, that was very important in the United States, and which is very similar in appearance to the architecture, the Mexican architecture, just the layout. You can just see that these things are from the same era. And then she would often, whenever she gave a talk, she would spend a lot of time writing it out. So a lot of her publications started off as talks, as lectures, and so on, and then got published. Before I get carried away on some side road here, I wanted to go back to On Designing. Oh, and the other books there were, of course, On Weaving, and there are two: the original On Weaving, as you see in the center, and then the revised and color illustrated, because all the illustrations in the original book, which was published in 1965, are black and white, and Princeton University Press then republished On Weaving with some other additional texts in 2017. And On Weaving is still sounds like, to all designers, textile people, it's just such a popular title that it's amazing that it's been, really has been in print since 1965 and is still in demand. And then I did want to also point out that she published another book which was called Pre-Columbian Mexican Miniatures, based on the collection that she and Joseph had assembled after they started visiting Mexico. And it has a beautiful foreword by her where she expresses it's not about textiles, it's about their collection and their ideas about collecting. And I think that has also been republished in, I think it's in Selected Writings, I put it in there. Or, no, it was in the catalog for one of the catalogs for her exhibitions. But so it's a really broad sort of area that she writes about. In the introduction to the original On Designing, the book down here, oops. We'll talk about. So here we see Annie, just to point out these photographs first. On the left, the neophyte designer at the Bauhaus, it's on your left, in my left. This is a classic photograph taken by Lucia Moholy-Nagy at the Bauhaus, 1922, which was when Annie arrived there as a 22-year-old. She was very conveniently born in 1899, so we don't have to calculate how old she was at a certain stage in her life. Her life spanned the whole of the 20th century. She was born in 1899. She died in 1994, so she had really had this complete view of the century. It's such a classic photograph, and it says something about textiles just in the light and the quality and the softness of her very elegant clothing. The center photograph is a photograph from the 50s when she was in Oaxaca and was learning to weave on a backstrap loom from the local weavers who are very interested in seeing this, probably this gringo trying to do what they did. And then on the right is a 1965 photograph of her with On Weaving when it just came out, the original book, in her front yard in her house in Connecticut. So it's kind of, we see her at different stages. Oops. Back a minute. So in the introduction to On Designing, the original On Designing, Edgar Kaufman Jr., who at the time was the head of the Industrial Design Department at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, this was 1959 publication, he wrote in the introduction that it is not easy to separate the person, the work, and the ideas in the work of Anni Albers. And I think that that is really kind of gives a sense of what her writings were about, because her attention to her writing, which she was also, her early writing, of course, she was German speaking. She came to the US in 1933. She never wrote in German after that, but she would put as much detail and as much work into her writing as she put into her weaving, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But I think it's so appropriate that he pointed this out. She would often spend a day thinking about a sentence. And this is not an exaggeration. It sounds like it is, but it's absolutely correct. She had seen in Europe, and later when she came to America, she had seen the effect of war. As a teenager during the First World War in Germany, and then later having emigrated to the US and to work at Black Mountain College. They arrived here in the end of 1933. But as you know, the clouds darkened over Europe, and her parents were caught up in the tumult in Europe. She was really found the world to be, and she writes about it, as a very confusing place. People of the world, they were lost. She felt lost. And she found a lot of comfort, I think, through her design and through her writing on design. So most of her writing is, she wrote 2 short articles that were published in Germany about the Bauhaus, and then the rest of her writing was in English. So she mastered the language and she studied it, and she actually, in the preface to On Designing, thanked the editors who, she said, had given her English form and syntax and helped her with this work. So it was a labor. Her weaving and her writing were sort of parallel paths and parallel labors in her life. So, just to continue. So her experience with, certainly with the First World War in Europe, and then again in with the war of 1938, brought out in her life the idea that of these themes of confusion and chaos that she saw in the world. And for her, art could bring balance and order to this world, to this confused world. And I think that she expressed this very much when she was not political. She didn't make statements about the wars, but her parents got caught up in 1938 in Germany. They were of Jewish descent. They had all been, the family had been converted, but they were Jewish. They were not practicing Jews, but of course they were Jewish, as she often said, in the Hitler sense. So in a wry kind of way. And her parents got caught up because, having been affluent and business people in Berlin, they considered themselves German, and in a really in a way that I think affected many Germans at the time, felt that they belonged in Germany. And so they finally left on one of the very last ocean liners that left Germany and brought them to the US when they could not even land in New York, and so they came to Veracruz, to Mexico, and debarked there. And as she wrote, her sister had got to England, and so she had this very visceral idea about her family having to escape, although she had already been here for 10 years. And in a letter to friends, and I think this is very kind of telling about her, she wrote in June 6, 1939, in a very personal way that she would never have spoken about really in public. She said, "This is my story." June 6, 1939. Today, we all feel as if life begins again. The parents out of Germany. My sister and husband and 3 children are in England. And nobody, also for them, left behind in Germany to worry about. My father owns for his future life $40. That's as close as she got to any kind of personal statement about her life. But she found solace in art, and it became the lodestar by which she really could orient her life. And she writes about this in a piece called Art, the Constant. Art would be the guide. It would be her faith in the materials hold the key to the creative process. And that the design process for her involves a give and take between materials and the designer. And she gave a very interesting talk at Black Mountain College, also seeing her way out of this confusion. A talk which was published only later in the later compilation that I made of her work, called, I call it On Jewelry. It was an untitled talk, but it was given in 1942 at Black Mountain College, where speakers were asked to talk about what they had done for the war effort, 1942, so this was just after America had entered the war. And invited to talk about the war effort, she raised the questions of values, social values. And she chose to talk about the jewelry that she had made, which you see up here, with a young student of hers, Bill Reed. She said, "Our work could not influence the course of the war. It took form only by being tried." They were inspired by jewelry that they'd seen in the tombs that were being excavated at Monte Alban, principally in Mexico. And they decided to make jewelry out of objects, mostly dime store, 5 and 10 cent stores as they were in the day. And she said it took form only by being tried. So this was creating a design practice out of what was available, what was cheaply available. And she contrasted that to jewelry that traditionally was made out of precious stones, diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, and of course also gold and silver. She said, "We were forced to use materials as we found them. And this brought about new ways of construction, new ways of linking parts together, new catches, new ways of suspending parts. Our greatest surprise was that others did not care about the value or lack of value of the materials, but enjoyed the value of surprise and inventiveness, a spiritual value." So she's at this point trying to ground herself in a world where the value of design is not in something precious or something ornamented, but it is in a kind of a practical using materials that were available. And she goes on, we tried to show that spiritual values are truly dominant, a clear way to a new seeing. And she goes on in this piece, if we can more and more free ourselves from values other than the spiritual, I believe we are going in a direction that will help prevent wars. Every general movement is carried by small parts, by single people forming their way of believing and subordinating everything to this belief. Just as you can go everywhere from any given point, so too the idea of any work, however small, can flow into an idea of true momentum. And this so captures her idea of truthfulness, of pure form, and of values not being based on material values, on basically on money and ornament and flashy design. As Kaufman noted in his introduction, her weaving practice and her writing are almost synonymous in a way. She believed in directness, being methodical, and striving for clarity, simplicity, and escape from clutter. And her writing, in a way, is kind of compressed into this sort of formal purity that she was looking for. She in an interview much later in 1985, she expressed this way of crafting, of making things, and she did, like Clara, she really felt that craftsmanship was really important, but it had to be craftsmanship that was making an intrinsic, pure sort of object. A careful build-up, a line-by-line crafting, precise yet experimental. And this is her talking about her writing. This is how she describes her writing, as though she was making a piece of art. Mm-hmm. She says, a careful build-up, a line-by-line crafting, precise yet experimental. It is no surprise, she said, that her sentences were, and this is her description of them, were really carefully thought out, and that it was hard labor to be precise. So she applied really the same ethics, if you like, to her writing as she applied to her work, her artwork, and her weaving. And in this sense, in a way, she was looking at, I think the war had really given her something very important to think about. And so she found these sort of constants in this work, this simple work, taking a simple object and making a design out of it. In a questionnaire much later that she filled out for the Museum of Modern Art, Mildred Constantine, who was then the director of the design department at MoMA in New York, said, "What meaning does the work have for you?" And Annie's reply, a written reply, it was a written questionnaire, she said, "Breathing does not express anything. One's work should be like breathing, essential to just being." So I think that really gives us an understanding of how deeply she was committed to the work, and that it wasn't, it was an intrinsic part of her, and she lined that up with her writing.
Brenda, do you think I can pause you there, just because I think this is a really important slide to have Jane jump off, because we all talk a little bit about how all three, Lena, Annie, Clara, they're really digging into these histories, sometimes borrowed histories and other cultures, but for other ways of being, in a way. And I wonder whether this would be a good transition point, maybe for Jane we can come back to our comments, maybe for Jane to talk a little bit about Lina Bobardi in this way, who also is looking at, you know, a lot of indigenous crafts and processes and cultures. Do you want to take the...
Yeah, sure.
Just because I'm
Great.
conscious of time.
So Brenda has a lot of amazing slides maybe we can come back to as well. And yeah, thanks so much to Zoe and the Hammer Museum for inviting me. It's really exciting to cross the little pond to this side of the world. LA is up there as one of my favourite cities. Another favourite city is Sao Paulo, which is where Lina Bobardi made her home in the late 40s. She actually landed in Rio de Janeiro from Rome in 1946, ostensibly to set up the Museum of Art Sao Paulo via a few exhibitions. And the museum was really going to be a place that would rethink museology, but also pedagogy. And Lina was going to do this not just through exhibitions, but through her writing. So we have Habitat magazine, which you can see here. Remember this image, this building on red stilts? So she actually made this collage in Rome before coming to Italy. And as you can probably guess, Habitat then becomes this mouthpiece for Lina's own work. So, you know, she came into a really masculine world. Artigas was getting going. You know, all of these kind of big names of modern architecture. Le Corbusier had already made his mark in the late 20s, and Oscar Niemeyer was on the rise. And she would take him to task on this in Habitat magazine. The middle image, you can see here, lists everybody who contributed to Habitat. It ran for about 5 years. The Bardis, so she was married to Pietro Maria Bardi, who was the director of Museum of Art of Sao Paulo. They edited the first 15 issues, and you can see Lina Bo, Bella Criança. So this is the article in which she describes Brazil as a new country. Bella Criança means beautiful child. She saw the potential in Brazil and its ability to take on modern themes and realize them through design. There's a reading of this article being actually maybe a reflection of Lina herself, right? She's come to this new country to kind of reestablish her life as a young architect and discover what it meant for her to make modern work in the Latin American context. You can see here she's dropped her married name. She's just Lina Bo. And also, you might notice this intriguing image of some cat's eyes. Alan Castro. Alan Castro was Lina. This was the name she gave herself in order to maybe say some gossipy things, be a bit provocative, have a little nudge at this bourgeois society, which she had actually really happily kind of joined, actually. They were part of this intellectual elite, and you know, as part of the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo, she really had a very privileged and influential position. But she really understood what this might mean and took this opportunity to, and as you can see in the kind of third image, introduce themes that may be the kind of European-looking middle classes might actually think as quite affronting, right? She's bringing the cultures of the Northeast, from Salvador, from Bahia, from the enslaved African people. You know, Brazil was the last country in the world to ban slavery in 1888. This was very recent history. So she's bringing these themes in, and she's saying, and this really echoes with Albers, with Porset, that indigenous cultures, the craft of the people really is where we should look for modern architecture and for a culture. And this was about being humble, working with kind of simple, poor materials. She references art povera, and she's really inserting these into the pages of a magazine that also, you know, showed incredibly expensive artworks from Europe. She really kind of messed around and used the pages to kind of talk about what modern culture should be about. She talks about industry, what Sao Paulo as an industrializing city should really be doing. She set up an industrial design school, so this was a kind of tripartite move: the museum, the magazine, and the school. And actually, importantly, a lot of Lina's writing is not her own. So for a full year before she establishes the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo, her husband Pietro Maria Bardi is weekly publishing articles about the new museum in Brazil. He says that Brazil has ambitious utopian thinking and that the new museum can only be realized in a country like Brazil. So echoing Lina's ideas in Bella Criança. So we have museums and public education, and we had museums and anti-museums, which are probably the two most famous texts, which talk about the importance of the museum in the city. The two are indistinguishable. And for the Bardis, it's not called, it's called the Museum of Art, not of modern art or of contemporary art, because everything could be art. And one of their employees complained because he saw an Olivetti typewriter in a display with lots of kind of Mayan sculpture and other bits. And he was like, someone's made a mistake. And Bardi had to say, no, it's all design, it's all art, it talks about people. So this is very important. And actually we see in a lot of Lina's writing, the compilations of her writing, the exclusion of her collaborative literature. People very much kind of looking for Lina's solo voice, and actually maybe this pluralism, this constant dialogue Lina had with people, as you can see here with the construction workers themselves, is central to her writing. In that sense, she doesn't really have the kind of published tomes that Albers has. She was publishing in newspapers. She wanted a visceral connection to the visitors of her museum. It was a dialogue. She was an orator. She was not that eloquent. She was also writing in Portuguese as a native Italian speaker. I include images here just to show how for Lina this maybe kind of interdisciplinary trespassing was really important. She sort of got her leather handbag, she's very stylish, she's on site, she's not adopting other characters to perform her role in this society where being a woman architect was particularly rare. But also, so she took this very kind of serious role, technical role. The Museum of Art of Sao Paulo had the longest concrete span in the world when it was made, so 72-meter free span. And she talked about this museum in the magazine, but she also talked about her cats. So cats were kind of a serious topic for writing. She talked about the importance of the cat to the studio, to the artist, and there are numerous pictures of Lina with her cats. So she had this kind of amazing way of bringing in really surprising themes and taking seriously ideas of imagination, of play, and importantly of creativity, and they could have come from anywhere. So an important thing to say about Lina's writing is that it also just appears everywhere, right? She's scrawling all over her drawings. This is really where much of her text appears, and those who've worked with her on projects, who I've spoken to, are at pains to say, these are technical drawings, right? They look beautiful, they look like illustrations, but they're kind of Lina's idea of a technical drawing. She also did like the technical drawings, but they were kind of indistinguishable. And they speak to the life that she was kind of trying to create in these otherwise very kind of heroic structures. For Lina, she made kind of big moves. She made fixed moves because she knew at the height of the military dictatorship, when both of these projects were realized, how easy that was to take away from the people. So at Sesqui Pompeia, she makes all of her furniture out of concrete. It's still there today because she knew they wouldn't move it if her cafe was made out of concrete. And at Maspi, she does these beautiful drawings of children inhabiting the public space with the building in the background, right? It's about institutional legitimacy, but not about the buildings themselves. So making these big marks in the city for occupation, which is what she is kind of constantly writing about in all of her works. And I mean, there's much to say about Lina. Maybe it will come out more in the discussion, but something really important is, in a way, this transnationality that we've kind of also discussed. She naturalized as a Brazilian in 1951, yet she kind of always retained this maybe Italian way of thinking. Her politics were very Italian. She was very much aligned with Gramsci and these other Marxist thinkers. And as you can see here, on the underside of the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo, she's inscribed the word libes in Italian for free, for freedom. And so we see this recurring in her work. She slips a lot. There's slippage, this kind of accidentally finding herself as a graphic designer or as a play coordinator or as Italian freedom fighter. We'll maybe ignore the bits where she says she's a Stalinist and an anti-feminist, but there's a lot of contradiction in her work and contradiction in the writing, and I think her ideas are, in fact, richer for it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's so much correlation between the three, and Valerie and I often talked about Clara Porset's own writing and her style, and we talked about Anni Albers. Clara Porset had these incredibly long sentences, which was always interesting to hear Valerie trying to translate what she was actually trying to say, you know, in her way. So she obviously had her own approach to how she wrote, which that wasn't as academic, I think, as potentially as Annie's was. I thought maybe two things that maybe we could touch on at the end. One is, you know, Valentina, very much one of the reasons I wanted to work with you, as you know, is that you come to architecture and design with a kind of social anthropological lens, and it's really about social practice and social justice, which I think we can all touch on, but also the importance in that then of these kinds of books that are kind of constantly, like maybe Brenda, it's with you that you're, you know, updating material, adding to material, but making sure that those books are in circulation, so her ideas are dispersed, which in itself is a social practice that we're now doing with this material. And for us, definitely thinking about Clara Porset and how important it was to do this book of writings, because at a certain point, otherwise all that material, you know, might dissolve, and you know, you really do need to pull it together at some point for it to make sense, or to get a broader picture of a person. So I wonder if you could all touch on, the idea of Brenda, you talked about it a little bit, the social practice, but also the importance that you felt in coming back to this writing. And Jane, it would be lovely to hear from you, because you work on, you know, designers and architects from the modernist period, but also you're publishing on contemporary architects, like how important that is in our landscape. I don't know who. Do you want to start a little bit?
Sure. Yeah.
And then I promise we'll open the floor to some questions. Maybe we just do a few minutes.
Yeah, very briefly. So I think that Porset's political background was very salient and very important to her at every stage of her work, and in all of the different components of her work, in her teaching, in her design, in her writing. And we can see this when she works with the artists for that precise exhibition of the catalog that we see here for the Art and Daily Life exhibition. Not only does she approach the objects as proper design and display them as objects of art as well, but she also credits everyone. So they're in the catalog, in the last pages of the catalog, there's a list of every object and every creator of the object, regardless of however the product or the object was made. So that is already speaking about how to treat people and people's work. Also, she discusses in correspondence with Esther McCoy about how she's trying to pay her own workers or her own employees a proper wage, and how that is making it difficult to do this thing of expanding her own market. And this was all, like, at every stage, this was all to try to reach that moment where society changes, and we don't necessarily know what that looks like, or what that would have looked like for her, or we sort of know how it happens maybe in the other direction currently, but I think she was trying to get elsewhere. She was going in a different direction as the one we are going now, where we're improving the life of people and of the majority, not of the very few that could afford luxurious design. Back then, they didn't need their lives to be improved. So she was hoping to make that societal change for the majority. And yeah, I think generally that's what I can say now.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think that certainly after in the late 40s, after the war, Anni Albers also was maybe caught up in this. There was a sort of turn to humanism, to unselfishness, to valuing objects, sort of going back, which had always been intrinsic to her, but to this idea of to turn away from possession. She writes about, possessing objects corrupts us, and that we have to fight against wanting more objects and wanting more possessions, because it is corrupting and it's debasing. And I think it's part of that the turn in the late 40s to away from extreme individualism to a new notion of a new kind of sort of humanism, of a secular humanism, which we see in the institutions, the setting up of the United Nations, for instance, this idea of a community and of a moral community as a response to the destruction that the world that Europe had gone through and the world had gone through during the war. And I think that is really and this was also, I think, somewhat influenced by John Dewey, who was also a humanist, and what was amongst, his ideas were behind the founding of Black Mountain College. But I think that that is where, in the most thoughtful way, and through her life and her experience of these destructive forces, and of the way that art and design meant her weaving work, and then this completeness of form and the comfort that she got really and the satisfaction from these designs. I think that is where today, turning away from the corruption really of possessions, as she described it, that she can lead us into a different way of thinking about the world, and a different way of thinking about through design, through structure and language and work. She talks about spiritual values. She doesn't talk about spiritual values in a religious sort of way, but she's talking about understanding. She's talking about nature a lot, and about things that are embodied in our world without having to be ornamented or precious, or a milk bottle and a light bulb. That's all you need, to live the good life in a way.
I think what's so important about this too is how much this resonates now, yes, and perhaps even more, yes, at this very moment. Yes. And I wondered, Jane, whether you can, talk a little bit about that in terms of, uncovering and especially with Elena Babadi's writing that only recently has been really kind of written about and dug into, but also maybe with some contemporary, what the contemporary lens is that you bring to this, to these projects.
Yeah, I think the important thing about writing and archives and documentation more broadly is that it leaves a trace. So, Lena did a good job at collecting. Another expert in this was Alison Smithson, who dedicated 1 day a week to archiving her own office whilst running her office. So this is kind of how we're able to discover, but also importantly with legacies pertaining to women biographies is oral history and testimony. So Lena worked with a lot of younger students who are still alive today and are able to kind of speak about her. I think the important thing is also to understand the complexity of women's lives, and that professional biography is often constructed actually by personal anecdotes. So a lot of the work of looking at most of my work's looked at around kind of 1900 to the present day, so it's really about framed by the professionalization of design practice. That where there are archives or people to talk to, it's been easier. It's extraordinarily hard when those things don't exist. But I think with history, this might be a controversial thing to say, but we should be a bit brave about fiction, just because the archive is a kind of work of fiction in itself. And in order to, and actually the artist Isaac Julian has done fantastic work to fictionalize Bobardi and tell us something about her life. So this interdisciplinarity, being artists as we think about history, is really important. And I think the kind of interconnected nature of the world has made it fantastically easy to just talk to people about themselves, which is really what Women Made. And I've got just a little plug, a new book on women interior designers coming out in the fall, and I spoke to 50, 60, 70 people firsthand. So as historians, I think we're kind of mediating this. But the real difference, I think, between people of Bobardi, Albers, and Porset's time and today is really twofold. One is the decoupling of politics from design, right? They all had an agenda which was deeply led by and believed in the ability of design to transform society. As designers, we're often now reduced to providing services. And therefore, I think also with a kind of competitive market that's been created, a lot of people don't really kind of feel like they have that ability or privilege even to kind of think about changing the world. And when they do, it's a bit demonic. The second thing is really the decline of print media. I think, as you know, you may have noticed from the slides, all of us have shown a magazine. I'd say there's one magazine in the UK that is worth reading for architecture, and no one reads it because it's really expensive. And there's no real good forums to publish, and that's why I think the work of women architects and their profiles would be much improved if we had a really good way to publish their work, but also for them to write like Lena did. Lena writes in newspapers because that is the voice piece of the people. Right, and I think design magazines can be that again, but I think also newspapers and more generally accessible publications can play that role. So I think it's important not only to think about these women and what they did in isolation, but all of the way in which the design world was able to kind of support them. And men obviously published a lot as well. So I think this sort of discussion is a really great way to actually think about how we might support designers of all types today.
I love that. That's a lovely way to finish. Goes back to the mission of institutions like the Hammer. And I'd love to open it up for. It's great that you're all still here with us, and see if there are any burning questions. And we do have microphones somewhere, right, Claudia? I see a 1, 2, 3, the fourth row back.
I don't really need a microphone. I just want to ask, which is the expensive British magazine?
What a great question.
Well, I have a subscription to the Architectural Review. Yeah.
The subscription numbers will go up tonight, I feel it. Any other questions? In the same, did I see a hand?
Thank you so much. It was really very, very engaging conversation amongst you. I wondered if you could talk about the experience of diaspora as a common thread in all of these practices. In relationship to 20th century diaspora, language being one of the aspects of diaspora for many of them, from German to Italian to, English, and how maybe there's a common thread in design from the diasporic experience and the language into modernism.
Great question. There's so much there, people.
Well, I do think that with Anni Albers, certainly it's the experience of having to switch languages. She had learnt English as a child. She'd had an English or an Irish governess, so she had spoken English, but it wasn't the right kind of English to write the writing that she did. And I think that it was possibly the discipline that she had to apply to her writing in order to express these ideas about form, because that's really, design and form was really what she was writing about, but she was able to extrapolate that into the everyday world, if you like. I think that she, the fact that she wanted to do this, and she read quite broadly in philosophy. She was very much influenced also by Alfred North Whitehead, who I find is the most difficult philosopher to even understand any of his writings, but she read that very thoroughly. So I think that all of this fed into it. So certainly, yes, I mean, the effort of the actual application to not only making a new life in a new country and having to put your old life behind you. And she did not return to Germany until 1960, and she only ever went back once, although Joseph went frequently to teach in the 50s. And she never said anything political about it, but it was very clear that she had to apply a certain discipline, a certain understanding of the forms of writing, just as she had to understand the forms of the materials and her work with materials. So I'm sure that does have a very strong sort of force in her life and in how she expressed herself.
I think it was for us. I think I can't speak for Valentina, but for us, it was one of the reasons why we didn't do a solo show of Clara Porset, right? We didn't start from that point. We could have done, but we were really interested in positioning her first within this transnational conversation, and also we were also at the Art Institute of Chicago, so it was like a perfect, these are very, these kinds of projects, we also realized in other parts of the world, we were in a very privileged position where we could, fly across to look at archives, or, if someone would say there was this, we went to Milan to look at the Triennale because, Clara Porset's work was in that, and we, dug into that archive. And you need some resources to be able to do that, right? But one of the, once you're in that setting of the Art Institute, and for me, it was very much about positioning architecture and design within an art museum. I also felt, there was many ways there that we were working to position Clara Porset in a much larger context, and also as I go back to 2019 in the in a political environment in the US where the dialogue around Mexico was so divorced from what we were reading about at that time, and this great migration into Mexico, and all the people that they were, Clara too, like Annie, they she came from quite a well-to-do family in Cuba, so she was able to travel around, but again, like Vali said, I think it is really interesting. We can't read. We don't know what it means, but when she got there, it took her so long, once Clara Porset got to Mexico, to actually then begin to write. So we think it was because she was, trying to position herself. And at that time, obviously she was, trying to be very present in those international conversations. And the Art in Daily Life exhibition is interesting because it had a venue in the middle of Mexico City, but also then it was shown again at UNAM. And there, like Frank Lloyd Wright and all these, incredible, famous architects and designers were going there for the architecture conference and would have seen that work. So she was quite interested in like how she was positioning herself within that kind of diasporic or transnational conversations. And then I think the only other part is we grappled a lot with the kind of especially with the indigenous, looking at indigenous sculpture or indigenous crafts practices for inspiration in her work and that diaspora. And I think, for Clara Porset, this wasn't about copying. This was really about trying to understand the forms and the materials and how they were worked from a very localized and historical point of view. And even that, like when she published in magazines, she would publish the image of the sculpture that she was looking at, next to the furniture, that she had made, really wanting to credit, make clear what her source point was and what her points of reference were. So the diaspora is it's very multifaceted. Would you?
Mm-hmm. So I think that brings to mind something again about one of the few sort of personal disclosures that Anni Albers made in her life, because she was a very introverted person in many ways. But in 1937, when Gropius arrived in the US, having come from via Britain to teach at Harvard or to assume his position at Harvard, she was at the docks to meet him, and that day there was a party or a reception for him in New York at the house of William Lescaze, who was a very prominent artist of the time. This amazing house on 41st Street in New York City that looked like nothing else because it was this modernist house in the middle of the brownstones, and she went to this kind of cocktail party, and afterwards she was alone in New York. I don't think she was with Joseph Albers, and she wrote to her friend Ted Dreyer at Black Mountain College, and she said, I went to this event tonight, she said, and people either thought I was a communist or a Nazi. And that's how uncomfortable she felt, that she couldn't, she had to struggle to place herself in this society. And another incident, which is also very telling, and she really didn't disclose a lot of these things, when she writes to Breuer, Marcel Breuer, the architect who'd commissioned her to do textiles for a house, and he said, you must become a salesman, you must be an American, you must put on a good show for the clients. And she said, I will never be a good salesman. I just, I would never do that. And so her values, I think, were not, I think the fact that she actually went to the Bauhaus from this very affluent, spoiled, upbringing, and you see that in that photograph, the Moholy-Nagy, Lucia Moholy-Nagy's photograph of Annie, that very formal photograph. But you can see it speaks of richness, of rich clothing, of, a kind of a poise. And I lost my track. There we are, there it is. So you see that, and I think it was a political act on her part to go to the Bauhaus, to want to get away from this very bourgeois, very upper bourgeois society that she had grown into, which she'd been brought up in, and to really strip away at all of this. And the Bauhaus just did this for her. And but then she had to reposition herself so soon afterwards. After 10 years at the Bauhaus, she had to then, and they welcomed the invitation to go to Black Mountain College. That, make no mistake about that. And she had an adventurous side, and she was a traveler, and she wanted that experience at the age of 30. But she also had to reposition herself in this society. And I think that's where a lot of that introspection and the thoughtfulness that she puts into her writing, in parallel with the thoughtfulness that she's putting into her weaving work, her artwork at the same time, I think that is, it's definitely there. So I think it's actually a really valuable question. Thank you.
Let's thank the panelists for a wonderful conversation. And if you have any burning last-minute questions, we will be outside with you all in a moment. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.